Around 1200 BCE, an entire network of Bronze Age civilizations that had flourished for centuries suddenly collapsed within the span of a few decades. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece was destroyed. Major cities across the eastern Mediterranean burned to ground. The sophisticated palace economies that had driven trade and culture across the ancient world disintegrated. And ancient records from a few survivors, particularly Egypt, describe a terrifying enemy they called the Sea Peoples. Mysterious invaders who arrived in massive fleets, destroyed cities, and left no trace of who they were or where they came from. Egyptian inscriptions desperately describe waves of attackers coming from the islands and the sea, destroying everything in their path as they swept across the Mediterranean. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought what he described as Egypt's most desperate battle for survival, defeating invaders at the gates of the Nile Delta in a conflict that saved Egyptian civilization, but left almost every other Bronze Age power in ruins. Yet we still don't know who these Sea Peoples were, where they originated, why they attacked, or where they disappeared after the Bronze Age world burned. This is history's most mysterious military catastrophe, an ancient apocalypse that destroyed civilizations and changed the course of human development, orchestrated by invaders whose identity remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, was a golden age of interconnected civilizations. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East formed a complex international system with diplomatic relations, trade networks, and cultural exchange spanning thousands of miles. Egypt controlled the Nile Valley and extended influence into Canaan and Syria. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia and northern Syria. Mycenaean Greece thrived with palace complexes at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and other centers. The Kassites ruled Babylon. The Assyrians controlled northern Mesopotamia. Cyprus was a major copper producer. The Minoans on Crete had declined but still participated in Mediterranean trade. These civilizations weren't isolated. They exchanged diplomatic letters, married their royal families to each other, traded extensively in metals, luxury goods, and raw materials, and maintained a delicate balance of power that kept the region relatively stable for centuries. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt, show this international system functioning with regular communication between kings addressing each other as brothers and negotiating trade deals, military alliances, and diplomatic disputes. Then, around 1200 BCE, this entire system collapsed with stunning speed. Within 50 years, almost every major Bronze Age civilization was destroyed or severely damaged. The Hittite Empire completely vanished. Their capital Hattusa was burned and abandoned, and the Hittite state ceased to exist. Mycenaean palaces across Greece were destroyed, many showing evidence of violent conflagration. Major cities throughout the Levant and Anatolia were sacked and burned. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city in Syria, was utterly destroyed and never rebuilt. The archaeological evidence for this collapse is undeniable. Excavations across the eastern Mediterranean reveal destruction layers from this period. Burned buildings, abandoned settlements, disrupted trade networks, and a dramatic decline in material culture. The sophisticated writing systems used by several Bronze Age civilizations, Linear B in Greece, Luwian hieroglyphs in Anatolia, disappeared entirely for centuries. This was a genuine dark age where literacy, large-scale architecture, international trade, and centralized government all collapsed simultaneously across a vast region. The question that has haunted archaeologists for over a century is, what caused this catastrophic collapse? Multiple factors were certainly involved. Climate data suggests drought and crop failures stressed agricultural systems. Economic overextension may have made palace economies fragile. Internal social tensions could have weakened centralized states. But the ancient texts consistently point to a specific catalyst: invasion by the mysterious Sea Peoples. The term Sea Peoples is modern, coined by archaeologists in the 19th century to describe the various groups ancient Egyptian texts mention as invaders coming from the sea. The Egyptians didn't use one collective name, but instead listed multiple groups: the Peleset Cheker, Shikalesh, Denyen, Weshish, Shurden, Lukka, and others. These names appear in Egyptian inscriptions describing two major invasion waves, one during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah around 1213 BCE, and a larger, more desperate conflict during Ramesses III's reign around 1177 BCE. The most detailed account comes from Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, where elaborate inscriptions and carved reliefs describe the Sea People's invasion. The inscriptions paint a terrifying picture. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. This passage is extraordinary. It describes a coordinated assault that destroyed the Hittites' Hatti, Syrian states Kode, Carchemish, Anatolian kingdoms Arzawa, and Cyprus, Alashia, simultaneously. The phrase conspiracy in their islands suggests the attackers came from island bases, possibly the Aegean, but their exact origin remains unclear. The Medinet Habu reliefs show the invaders arriving in distinctive ships with high prows and stern posts, wearing feathered headdresses and kilts, carrying round shields and long swords. They brought their families with them. The reliefs show women, children, and possessions loaded on ox carts, suggesting this wasn't just a raid but a migration of entire populations seeking new lands. But who were they? Scholars have proposed numerous theories. Some suggest they were displaced Mycenaean Greeks fleeing the collapse of their own civilization. Others propose they were Anatolian refugees from the Hittite collapse. Some theorize they were Western Mediterranean peoples, perhaps from Sicily, Sardinia, or Italy, expanding eastward. A few researchers have even suggested they were a coalition of diverse groups united by circumstance rather than a single ethnicity. The individual group names provide tantalizing clues. The Pele set are widely believed to be the Philistines, who settled in Canaan after their defeat by Egypt and appear prominently in the Hebrew Bible. The Shurden might be connected to Sardinia. The Shikalesh possibly relate to Sicily. The Denyen could be the Denoi, Homer's term for Greeks. But these connections are speculative, based on similarities in names that might be coincidental. Archaeological evidence from destroyed cities adds details, but not clarity. At Ugarit, archaeologists found evidence of hasty preparation for defense before the city's final destruction. A letter found in the ruins describes a desperate plea for help. The enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. This confirms naval attacks, but doesn't identify the attackers. At Troy, Layer VIA shows destruction around 1200 BC, traditionally associated with the Trojan War. Whether this destruction involved the Sea Peoples or was part of the broader collapse pattern remains debated. The timing aligns with both the legendary Greek assault on Troy and the Sea People's activities, raising the possibility that Greek oral tradition about the Trojan War preserved memories of this tumultuous period. Cyprus shows evidence of destruction followed by cultural change, with new pottery styles and burial practices appearing after 1200 BCE. This suggests population replacement or significant migration, possibly related to Sea Peoples settling the island after unsuccessful attacks on Egypt. Egypt's survival is remarkable given that almost every contemporary civilization fell. Pharaoh Merneptah fought the Sea Peoples in the Nile Delta around 1213 BCE. Defeating an invasion force he claimed numbered in the tens of thousands. The inscriptions describe desperate fighting and ultimate Egyptian victory, with thousands of enemy dead and prisoners taken. 36 years later, Ramesses III faced an even larger invasion. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe both a land battle in Syria-Palestine and a massive naval battle in the Nile Delta. The naval battle reliefs are particularly detailed, showing Egyptian archers on ships and shore raining arrows on enemy vessels, grappling hooks pulling enemy ships close for boarding, and invaders falling into the water in defeat. Ramesses III's victory was complete but Pyrrhic. Egypt survived but was exhausted, drained economically and militarily. The cost of defending against the Sea Peoples, combined with internal problems, led Egypt's decline in subsequent centuries. The Egypt that defeated the Sea Peoples never fully recovered its former power. After their defeat by Egypt, the Sea Peoples disappear from history as mysteriously as they appeared. Some groups apparently settled in the Levant. The Philistines established cities in Gaza, Ashkelon, and other coastal locations. Others vanish entirely from the record. There's no evidence of a Sea Peoples state or empire emerging after their invasions. They destroyed the old world but didn't create a new order in its place. This has led some scholars to question whether the Sea Peoples were even a coherent entity. Perhaps Sea Peoples is a catch-all term Egyptians use for various groups of migrants, raiders, and refugees displaced by the Bronze Age collapse rather than a unified invasion force. The collapse itself might have had multiple causes: drought, famine, internal rebellion, systems collapse, with the Sea Peoples being as much symptom as cause. Climate science provides crucial context. Core samples from lake sediments and cave formations show a dramatic dry period beginning around 1200 BCE, lasting for centuries. This mega-drought would have devastated agricultural economies dependent on consistent rainfall. Crop failures could trigger famine, economic collapse, and massive population movements as desperate people sought new lands. In this scenario, the Sea Peoples might have been climate refugees, populations displaced by environmental catastrophe who migrated en masse, destroying cities and kingdoms in their path not from organized military strategy, but from desperate need for resources and land. The destruction of the Bronze Age world becomes less a military conquest and more a humanitarian catastrophe on an enormous scale. Recent archaeological work has added complexity to the picture. Excavations at sites across the eastern Mediterranean show that the collapse wasn't simultaneous or uniform. Some cities were destroyed violently, others abandoned gradually, and some survived but declined. This suggests a complex process rather than a simple invasion narrative. The Bronze Age collapse was a cascade of failures where environmental stress, economic disruption, military conflict, and social upheaval reinforce each other in a catastrophic feedback loop. The systems collapse theory proposes that Bronze Age civilizations have become so interconnected and interdependent that disruption in one area cascaded throughout the system. When trade routes were cut, palace economies that depended on imported tin for bronze weapons and tools collapsed. When major powers like the Hittites fell, the diplomatic balance maintaining peace broke down. When literacy was lost, administrative capacity to manage complex states disappeared. The entire interconnected system unwound rapidly once critical nodes failed. Genetic studies of ancient DNA from this period might eventually provide answers about population movements and the Sea Peoples' origins. Preliminary results show genetic continuity in some regions and discontinuity in others, suggesting a complex mix of population displacement and continuity. As more ancient DNA is analyzed, we may finally determine whether the Sea Peoples were invaders from outside the Mediterranean world or displaced populations from within it. The legacy of the Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples' invasion shaped the subsequent ancient world profoundly. The destruction of the palace-based economies led to the rise of smaller, more resilient city-states. The loss of bronze-working knowledge due to disrupted tin trade accelerated the adoption of iron metallurgy, beginning the Iron Age. The collapse of centralized states created space for new peoples and cultures to emerge: the Phoenicians, the Hebrew kingdoms, the Greek polis system, none of which could have developed under the old Bronze Age order. In this sense, the Sea Peoples, whether invaders or refugees, destroyers or merely witnesses, were agents of historical transformation. They, or the catastrophes they represented, swept away an old world and cleared space for a new one. The Mediterranean that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was fundamentally different. More fragmented politically, more diverse culturally, and ultimately more dynamic than the stable but rigid world that preceded it. Walking through museums displaying Bronze Age artifacts, the weapons, pottery, and inscriptions from the civilizations that fell, you're confronted with the fragility of complex societies. These were sophisticated civilizations with writing, art, architecture, and trade networks. They seemed permanent, inevitable, eternal. Yet within a few decades, they vanished, leaving only ruins and a few desperate inscriptions describing invaders from the sea. The Sea Peoples remain one of history's great mysteries. Were they a unified invasion force or disparate refugees? Were they the cause of the Bronze Age collapse or merely another symptom of a civilization-wide system's failure? Did they consciously destroy the old world, or were they swept along by forces beyond anyone's control? After more than a century of archaeological investigation, we still don't have definitive answers. What we do know is that around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world died violently, and mysterious peoples from the sea were there when it happened. Whether as murderers, witnesses, or fellow victims, the Sea Peoples were present at one of history's greatest catastrophes. And then they vanished, leaving behind only Egyptian inscriptions, destroyed cities, and an enduring mystery that continues to challenge our understanding of how civilizations rise, fall, and sometimes disappear entirely, taking their secrets with them into the darkness of history.